Right. Okay. Yes, so this is part 2. I'm just going to pray for us. Jesus, I just thank you for the opportunity to come together. Let us, not overlook that, and how, that in parts of the world that's just not that easy to do. And we thank you, Jesus, that we are able to come together as a church family and worship you freely. And we just thank you and for your promise of your presence amongst us. And I just pray that you would speak to us now and encourage us now through your word, God. That as we hear your word, that faith is imparted to us, that its faith comes and rises up inside of us. God, as we put more hope and more trust in who you are, and as we grow in our understanding of who you are and what you've done in our lives. And Jesus, I pray you just use my declaration now and encourage us in that, in your precious name. Amen. So this is going to be, we're going to have to do a bit of a recap on this one. Who was here last week? Raise your hand if you were here last week. Pressure's on for you. Okay, and so quickly then, if you wouldn't mind recapping for the rest of them, just what did we cover? What were we looking at?
Abraham.
The life of Abraham and Sarah, yes. 4,000 years ago, a couple, and just hit me then with key things that happened during the course of their life. Anything you can remember from last week, or if you've read your Bibles in Genesis, anything you know about their life.
It started in
That's right, yes. They started out there, and they lived there for a time, God told them to go. Fantastic, thank you.
Everything took a long time.
Everything took a long time. And I'll come back to that one in a second, but thank you. Everything took a long time. What else happened in their life? They had a son. Anyone know what the son was called? Not Jonathan. Isaac. Okay, well, tell us a little bit more. 2 sons, what's this?
Well, Abraham was son with his wife's maidservant.
So they had a son called Ishmael, which was, a point in the story, where basically they, God, had promised them this child, and rather than wait on God, and we'll see, everyone should wait on God, but we'll see lots of time passes, rather than wait on God, they get impatient, and they decide that actually, because they believe that Sarah is the one that can't have children, so they use Sarah's maidservant, and they have a child called Ishmael before, but then God says that isn't the child that I've promised you. It is going to be a child that comes from Sarah, and that is the promised son Isaac. Anything else that we can know about?
Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, and he took him to be sacrificed. But God sent an angel to say, you don't need to. Continue.
So absolutely, David. So right near the end, so after all this promise that God has said, Isaac, you're going to call him Isaac, so God sets all of that out and says, this son is going to be the one through whom you're going to bless the nations, and through you're going to have many, many ancestors through this child. God then does this extraordinary thing about, and we don't know, we think it's between 10 and 30 years old Isaac is at this point, and God set tests, it says in the thing, this came up with Josiah's driving test, God tests Abraham, and it's this most scary thing to think that God could test someone. God's going to put you through a test, and it is this test of taking Isaac and then putting him as a sacrifice, and then at the last minute an angel from God intercedes, stops it at the last minute, and Isaac is rescued, and it would seem to suggest that in it all that Isaac was in some way aware of what was going on, but Abraham throughout his life at this point suddenly has this moment of trusting God no matter what. And we'll come on to look at that. It's a really key part of the story. So yeah, anything else that anyone else can remember from last week?
Like Sarah, she maybe had heard the promise, and it's about her. Why should she trust Abraham?
I did mention that. Yeah, that's just an interesting point about this, is that often we talk about Abraham, and sometimes we forget Sarah's in the story as well, all the way through it. And actually it does focus quite a lot more on Abraham. And God speaks to Abraham really clearly at points in the story, a number of times during this time period. God speaks to Abraham. But actually there's little until they get to the age of 100, or Sarah's actually 90, or 89, when God speaks to her directly as well. She gets something. But the rest of the time, we don't know. We just, was it she was hearing it from her husband? And her husband had put her in a few compromising situations over the course of his life. So he wasn't this perfect character. Okay? He wasn't this perfect character. And so we've got this story, we've got this bit of a recap. And as I say, why all this came about was because I said that Hebrews 11, which is what we've been looking at, is all of these stories and these characters of faith and people of faith. And what we need to, for us, it helps us to know their story, because when you illustrate something with a story, it helps to know what's gone on in that story. So for the people that heard this for the first time, they would have known about Abraham and Sarah a lot. And for us, it really, really does help us if we're really, really familiar with the story, because it makes us think a bit more about it. Because if we read it and just think, oh, Abraham, well, it must have been easy for him, his life must have been easy, or Abraham and Sarah's life must have been easy, and they just were unwavering in their commitment to God, they never put a foot wrong, we might misunderstand what this is really all about. Because actually when we look at it, we see that actually there's an incredible amount of time that passes in their lives. They come from the place called which possibly is down here. There is some debate whether it's up here somewhere. But they travel across with their family to this place, Haran, which is believed to be here. And then there's 75 years happens in this period, and we don't know a lot about it. But then we get down, they travel down, as God, as Tina said, they travel down into Canaan, this land. And they live there, but they're waiting for this child. They're promised it, but they're waiting. 10 years pass. And then we get this kind of, we're going to shortcut God, and we're going to have a child through Abraham, which is Ishmael. They shortcut God. But then when that all finishes, then they still wait another 13 or 14 years. And then they have to wait another year. And then when they have Isaac, another 10 to 30 years before this incident of giving up Isaac over back to God. And then we see their lives, they die 137 years and 175 years, and still they haven't seen the fullness of what was promised to them. So it's a long period of time, and that's really important. And through it, it's not so much about their faithfulness. That's important in it, but actually what you really see if you look through it is God's faithfulness to them. And we'll come on to look at that a bit more. So, Jonathan said a few weeks ago about Hebrews, one of the things it's trying to make the point here is that faith here is something quite concrete, in that faith shows itself through action. So all of the stories in Hebrews 11 show that actually faith isn't some vague woolly thing, that actually faith is much more real than that, and it actually shows itself in the things that people do, in how they respond to God, in the choices they make. But it also shows you about faith is actually where you do turn when you are anxious, or you are worried, or you are discouraged, or you are frustrated. See, it's also about when we're called to obey, when being called to obey means actually possibly uncertain outcome, or actually it's going to cost us something. And faith shows itself when we don't see things, but actually when we don't give up waiting for them. And the key to all of this is faith comes from actually who God is himself. And it's who he is, what he has promised, that he is faithful to his promises, that he's going to stick to them, and that also he's got the power to be able to do what he says he's going to do. That actually nothing can stop him, nothing can limit him from what he wants set out to do. And the faith of Abraham and Sarah showed itself trusting God at these key points in their lives and committing to him. So when God said go, as Tina said, he left his home, he left the people of his tribe, his group, and he went into a foreign land. So we've looked a little bit about his story, and we could go more on it. I just want to mention a couple of other things about it. Firstly, God's promises to Abraham are really important for us to get a scale of. So one of the promises that he says to Abraham is that your descendants are going to be as numerous as the sands on the seashore or the dust on the ground. And this is a little bit of dust. I didn't have any sand. I'm going to just put it on there. The dust on the ground. Now, I don't know how much dust is in that, but in a teaspoon of dust is about 25,000 particles or something, if you believe Google. But it's meant to show the immensity of God's promise to him. And he also says it's like the stars that are in the night sky, and obviously then they didn't have light pollution, so again, he says it's immense. The number of people that are going to, the blessing that you are going to experience is going to affect millions and millions of people. And as I said, sometimes we see in the life of Abraham and Sarah that they try and force God's hand. Their impatience gets in the way, and they try and sort of get ahead of God, of what God's doing. But he says he doesn't give up on them at that point. He actually comes back to them and says, no, I'm going to, through you, through Sarah, and through Abraham, I'm going to do this. And so we're going to read Hebrews 11, 8 to 19 now, this is the bit on faith that it talks about their life. And it says this: by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. And by faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was able to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. And all of these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and they welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, then they would have had opportunity to return. But instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So this short bit of Hebrews is a commentary on the life of Abraham and Sarah. And I'm a bit embarrassed to admit that when I've read that a few times or whatever, I actually sort of skipped over the highlighted in there about her faith in this. And as I said to you last week about noticing her part in this story. Theirs wasn't a perfect life, and it wasn't a life that didn't have moments of doubt and fear. We see Abraham lying at times during his life. Both of them laugh at God at the promise that they're going to have children in their old age. And they have times where they panic and they despair. and they try to force things with their own plans. But in the end, it is a life that Abraham and Sarah do stay the course with God. And Hebrews sort of bookends their life with two events, the going and the leaving, and then the sacrifice, the act of obedience to take their son, this promised son, and put him as a sacrifice. And what comes through it is God's faithfulness to them, as I said. In Genesis 12, God starts this story. He takes the initiative. We don't know who Abraham is much. We know a little bit, but we don't know whether he's a good guy or a not so good guy, what sort of couple they were. But God takes the initiative and he makes a promise to them. And throughout his life, he keeps doing it. He keeps and he expands on the promise, but he keeps showing how faithful he is. And he shows them that really this shows that God is the one in charge here, and God is the one with the power to do this. Both Abraham and Sarah were beyond the point of where they could have had children. Their hope was as good as dead. But then God acts and says what he'll do, what he's promised. And these people are meant to encourage us. Jesus has come now. So what they didn't see, but we now see, is that Jesus, this promised fulfillment, has now come. And I just want to illustrate this with a bit of an illustration. Who's got good eyesight here? Who would say they've got good eyesight? Oh my word. We're in church. Vocally challenged church. You have. You can't hear, but so you didn't get a question. That's the problem. Right. Can you read the first one of those?
No, it's not that good.
So it's not that good. No, you can't read it from a distance. No. Okay. Felicity, would you just read that for me? The first one.
The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
Okay, thank you. That was one of the promises that God made. That was the promise to Abraham. The point about the distance thing. They saw something of what God had said from a distance. But that promise is fulfilled through Jesus. We have seen Jesus. So we see it like Felicity. We see it close up. We see more than and that's the point of this bit of this chapter, is they saw it from a distance. But we actually see Jesus now. And in seeing Jesus, we see what God was speaking about in a much clearer and richer way. But we're also waiting for Jesus to return. The final chapter in the story. For Jesus to bring to completion what he started at the cross. So we shouldn't really be surprised that we don't see it all working out now, because God doesn't seem to work in that. He seems to take his time over things. People who first received this letter in Hebrews were experiencing that sort of disappointment, that God wasn't doing what they expected him to do. And they were kind of having troubles that they weren't perhaps expecting, or they were discouraged that they weren't seeing what they hoped to see. And the point about Hebrews was all about, well, fix your eyes on Jesus. Keep your eyes on the fulfillment of all the promises. And that's what Jonathan highlighted when we looked at this, is that really what this is all about is not about whether we see this thing happen or that thing happen, as much as it is much more about actually putting our trust and hope in a person. Everyone in Hebrews 11, with one exception, and you can read that for yourself if you want to read the passage, experienced death. But right at the end, the writer of Hebrews 11 reminds us of this, that God has a perfect ending planned for them and us. And so there's a Psalm 27, verse 13 and 14, it says this, "I will remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." The promises back then to them still haven't been fully realised. But like them, we're going to wait patiently and faithfully for it. We'll pray and we will wait for God to do and God to act. And as I said, Jesus has now come, and that's something that Abraham and Sarah, those people from the Old Testament, they just didn't see it. They only welcomed it from a distance. And everything in Abraham's life foreshadows that. So even when we look at something, and we said about wrestling with God, if you don't wrestle with the bit about when God says, I'm going to test Abraham, but actually if we look at that and we think, where else does that happen? Where else does God take a son and offer him as a sacrifice? So everything that happens there is actually a foreshadowing of what is happening with Jesus. And that Jesus is this chosen son, this son who obediently, and as I said, there seems to be cooperation from Isaac in his story, but Jesus is the son that cooperates with the Father and goes willingly to sacrifice. And maybe our faith is going through a season of testing. And at that moment, I don't know about you, but it's a real choice whether we go to God in that whether we bring our struggles and our questions to him. Why is this happening? And these are the times when we must wrestle with God, reminding ourselves, we remind ourselves of his faithfulness and his promises of who he is. And yet at the same time, we're also confronted with realities of, I'm going through really difficult times at the moment. I'm going through suffering. I'm experiencing, or I can see injustice around me. And maybe the cloud doesn't lift immediately. But my problem is I often give up too easily. Or even, I don't even take that stuff to God. But he does invite us to. And what I'd suggest is it's in that swinging of backwards and forwards with God around your questions and around those things that actually our faith muscles grow. What it really means to trust God when you can't see the way ahead. Coming to know and realise that God clings on to me or clings on to us more than we can ever to him. And in Romans 4:18 it says this, Abraham, against all hope, he believed, and so became the father of many nations. Just as it said of him, so shall his offspring be. See, we're the children of Abraham and Sarah, and we're to learn from their experiences, and we're heirs of the same promise. Now, I don't know if you've heard of that phrase, it's a common phrase. It says we're called blessed to be a blessing. Well, of course, that comes from the bit that Felicity read. That's from Genesis 12. It's the promise to Abraham, and it's the same promise that we've got. And sometimes I've heard it mistakenly used to mean that somehow life's going to be easy if you're a Christian then. Life's going to be simple and you're going to get, things that, everything's going to go perfectly fine. You get a parking space when you need it. You win the lottery or whatever it is. That's not what it's talking about. It's saying that we are blessed because we're no longer under God's judgment. And it means that our lives now are such that they're lives that are freed up from any other concern because we have a secure inheritance with Jesus. We know that. And therefore we're free to serve people, to love people, to pay cost in this life because of that. And we can do that. I mean, we can bless people not because they deserve it, but because it's the life that God has called us to. It's why when it says we can love and pray for our enemies. And as I said, Jonathan said a few weeks ago, this is all about Jesus being Lord, even when we don't see it. That's what Abraham and Sarah saw from a distance. Jesus at the cross has won. And if we put our trust in him and that victory, we can't lose. Nothing in this life is permanent. And everything in the next is already promised as our inheritance because of Jesus. More than that, Jesus is our reward. One of the interesting parts of one of the promises that God makes to Abraham is he says, I am your reward. That's what God says to Abraham. I am your reward. And that's what it is. That's what this is talking about. That Jesus is the thing. Not the things that Jesus gives us, but Jesus is the thing. Knowing and being known by Jesus is the great reward. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia book, says this, there are far better things ahead than we leave behind. And Jim Elliot, who was a missionary who gave his life trying to share Jesus with the Orca Indians in South America, he said this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And Jesus said it like this: "If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it." So I want to finish by saying, do we have the faith in the God of Abraham and Sarah, who promises sons and daughters, brothers and sisters to come into the family, as many as the sands on the dust on the ground or the stars in the sky? And as Abraham said to Sarah at a point of crisis, is anything too hard for the Lord? But it's also the God that sees us in our weakness and steps in and is always faithful to us. And he says to us, trust me when things are hopeless, as good as dead. And he invites us to be people that live and hope for something better, that knowledge of what is temporary and what is eternal. And I put on there the tent, because Abraham throughout his whole life lived as a foreigner and as a temporary dwelling, because he knew that actually God was his reward and being with God was his real home. And faith is also rooted in real lives. This couple, where they faced real danger, where their suffering and the years of agony of waiting for this promise was real, where they had real anxieties and real doubts. But their faith showed itself in trusting God, who kept speaking to them, kept promising, and he had shown that he is faithful through his son, giving of his son Jesus. Abraham and Sarah could have returned all the way back up into Haran and across to Ur, and they also tried to force God to move at a different pace. But in the end, they did keep their faith, and they kept on course, and they kept fixing their eyes on God's faithfulness to his promises. Is our faith that we've got our eyes fixed on a living Saviour that says in our lives that Jesus is Lord? And it means that he's Lord of every aspect of our life, or he can't be Lord at all. And the time between promise and fulfilment of promise is testing. Waiting patiently for God to act is tough, and it requires faith. And they kept trusting in God over years, over decades, to get what God had promised. And I guess if we get to that place where we can't, where we just feel that actually our doubts and our questions overwhelm us, then I'd also just say that's a pretty good place to start, to be honest, because faith itself is a gift from God. And there's that man who approaches Jesus when he just can't, he's got to that point. He says, look, I believe, but help me with my unbelief. Because that's one of the things that God promises us is his Holy Spirit. That's our deposit guaranteeing our inheritance. And the Spirit, God's Spirit, is the one who is a comforter, and he's the one who's the encourager. And God's faith is fed by his word. So we have to humbly get before God with our doubts. And we have to keep going back to his word. And we also have to draw on the other witnesses. That's what this is all about. Looking to these people, but looking to one another as well. And I know for me, it's those times when other people have reminded me of God's faithfulness, who prayed with me, that have really helped me through those things. And it's these things that we need to do when our faith or our questions or our life is taking a battering. And if God has been teaching me anything over the last few years, it's be patient. And when I spoke on that probably a year ago or so, I spoke on the fruit of patience. It's the fruit of the Spirit, and I spoke on it. And I said there's a world of difference between a patiently waiting Christian and one who's just passing the time. The patient Christian will be a prayer, and they will keep obeying Jesus, and they will keep feeding on his promises. They will have a living intent mentality to how they order their lives. They will be ready to move and act when God speaks. And their eyes will be fixed on Jesus, because it will be faith that's rooted in a living Saviour. And it will be a faith that cries out, Jesus, be Lord of my life. As I sing those worship songs, I don't know about you, but sometimes I sing them and I think, God, somehow you're going to have to you are supernaturally going to have to make that part of who I am. Because actually I sing those things and I say those things, but actually when I look at the state of my life and I look at the things that I see in my life, I realise that actually, God, you are going to have to do this. It's a prayer and a cry as much as it is a declaration of things. And we need to be people that pray for that. Jesus, be Lord of my life. Your kingdom come. Be my great reward. Don't let me be distracted by the things around me that look so attractive as reward, but be my treasure. And it says in Hebrews 6, and I'm going to finish with this passage, it says, in Hebrews 6 verse 12, it says, we do not want you to become lazy, but to be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, and he says, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so, after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. And so, if we're a people that really live by faith, will we? What I'd love to do is just, could we have the band up, just sing a final song and we will finish. And just as we sing, I just want us to just make it a prayer. Make the words of the song a prayer in your own life. And if there are things where elements of doubt and where you are struggling, or areas of your life where Jesus is not Lord, then I want you to I don't want you to try and fix that on your own. I want you to come to the living Saviour, to Jesus.